This episode is supported by PIMCO, a global leader in active fixed income with deep expertise across public and private markets. PIMCO invests their clients' capital in income and credit opportunities that span the liquidity spectrum, leveraging their decades of experience navigating complex debt markets. Their flexible capital base and deep relationships with issuers have helped them become one of the world's largest providers of traditional and alternative investment solutions and a valued financing partner. Visit pimco.com to learn more.
One is never ask anybody to do something that you yourself wouldn't do. One is to know yourself and know your strengths. Someone pointed out to me a long time ago, they said that this is a really big ask. And I said, but I'm not asking anybody to do something that I wouldn't myself be able to do. I said, yeah, but you can do things so much more quickly than other people. And I hadn't recognized that. So I think recognize your differences in working style. Treat people as you would like to be treated yourself. Respect people, and in the pensions arena, put members at the heart of what you're trying to do, and that will bring it all together.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Penny Green, who's retiring from the investment industry at the end of this month, following an over 30-year career. She started her career in pensions in 1987, spent a long stint at TPAS, where she was Deputy Chief Executive when she left, then became Chief Executive of SAUL, where over the past 4 years, I've had the privilege of working with her on the investment committee. Upon retiring from the chief executive role in 2014, she became an independent trustee with BESTrustees, and her portfolio included a trustee role at SAUL and chair of an organization focused on raising standards of pension administration. She was president at the Pensions Management Institute for over 2 years. Welcome, Penny. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with a bit about your background and how you ended up pursuing a role in the investment world and pensions in particular. Can you just take us through the start of your career, and were there any surprising turns in there?
Well, I suppose in some ways my career in pensions started, I'm not unusual in this, it started almost by accident. I actually didn't know anything about pensions or investment, but I saw a job advertised in HR and applied for that. And the company contacted me and said, well, we've got another job for you in pensions, which is paying £500 a year more. Would you be interested in that? And bearing in mind that I was not being paid at that time in 87, I think my salary had just scraped over £10,000 a year. An extra £500 a year made a big difference. So I said, yes, thank you very much. I will take that. I went through the interview process, got the job, and discovered that I was going to be working in pensions, which I did know about, but we were the pensions world was going through a massive upheaval at that time because we were transitioning from an era where membership of a pension scheme was compulsory, and that was being abolished from the 1st of April 1988. So I joined this firm in 1987 at the back end of the year, and within 4 months was presenting the pension scheme, the new pension scheme, to the employees who previously had been in a non-contributory scheme, and the scheme had been completely rechanged before my time, and presenting them this new contributory scheme. And that's how I ended up in pensions. And I absolutely loved it. It's highly technical, which it obviously is. It's much, much more complicated now than it was then, but it is highly technical. But you've got that huge people element, which is so engaging. It doesn't really matter what you do if you've got a retirement. Each retirement is different because everybody's experience of their work and what have you is different. And I just love that combination of the highly technical stuff and the human element, and found my niche and took it from there.
And it's great because listening to you at retirement, speaking about this members first mission and drive that's always guided you through this career. How would you say that developed then, and how has that kind of evolved and as a centre of why you do this?
I think, I've always wanted for people to understand. So that was sort of quite important. Why are you writing a letter if the person at the end is not going to understand a word you've written? You've wasted your time. But the members first thing really came to its fore when I worked at TPAS, when we were looking at complaints, some justified, some not, some less so. But the underlying theme of everything that came through was people just did not understand. And I'm thinking, well, you're paying for this. You're paying with your contributions. And even if you're in a non-contributory pension scheme, your salary has probably been adjusted a bit to reflect that. So you're paying for this, and yet you don't understand, and you feel that something's gone wrong. And then when you did find, and it wasn't very often, but you did find occasionally real malpractice, that's absolutely wrong. That's really not the right way to go. And so having sort of had a member focus to start with, I think my time in TPAS really, really strengthened that and said, the pension scheme is here for the members. An employer doesn't set it up for no reason whatsoever. As employers don't establish pension schemes because necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts. There's a commercial reason for that, as there is for any business making an expenditure decision. There has to be a commercial reason for it. But at the end of the day, the employer is spending a lot of money on this. The members should be put at the heart of it so that they understand the value of that. So I think that's where it started.
And have you found, this is the challenge, I've heard some other pension industry advocates mention, the challenge of getting member engagement. As you said, they do pay for it. It is directly impactful to them, what the outcome is. But do you find that member engagement is difficult to establish?
Oh, it is the perennial challenge. You do get engagement, but invariably it's probably when it's too late to make significant changes to what your pension outcomes are going to be, unless you get really lucky with the investment strategy. But I think as an industry, we spend an awful lot of money, and I do question how we can change that, the engagement of younger people. But I do also wonder whether we're not just trying to do the impossible. You know, if you're 30, you can't retire now till you're 68. So that's a whole lifetime, more than your lifetime ahead of you. And in the meantime, you'll be grappling with student loan, possibly a mortgage. You've got young kids coming up, which are expensive, and something that is not going to happen in your life, but over a lifetime away for you. I think it's very difficult for us to try and say, we know it's more than your lifetime before this event happens, but actually you should start thinking about it now. I think we beat ourselves up that we don't get the engagement we should have, but I think that we're being unfair to ourselves, because if you look at people's lifetimes or people's lives, what they're experiencing, something that's going to happen a long time off is really not high priority. You know, it's like if I'm going on holiday in 3 years, you know, I might be planning a holiday for 3 years off. I'm not actually going to put an awful lot of thought into that as opposed to the one that I'm taking in 3 months.
It makes perfect sense. And you're right, there is a bit of beating oneself up about it. I suppose that places then the onus onto the trustees to do their part.
Yeah, I think it is. You know, I'm not saying let's just sit on our hands and do nothing. I think that's absolutely wrong. But I think we just need to reflect the audience that we're looking for. And technology is fabulous now. I mean, when I started, we would write to people, we'd write a letter, and then they would have to write back. And occasionally, if it was urgent, you'd phone. An awful lot of stuff that was produced was written as if it had been written in the 1970s. I mean, it just wasn't engaging. We weren't telling people much about their pension schemes. And the first change in that was really when we had what we called the disclosure regulations, which I've never really liked the expression disclosure. As someone pointed out to me, that when we disclose something, it's almost like we've got some information and we're just going to give you a little bit of it. We're disclosing a bit to you rather than actually telling people what they need to know. So I think we do need to, as trustees, think about what information we're giving people and addressing the audience. And now the technology allows you to sectionalize and compartmentalize your membership so that you can change the messaging of what you're doing and try and find those hooks that will get people interested.
And that's a great segue to just a discussion of a little bit of pensions industry, where we are today in terms of state of play. You've spoken about evolution and would like to think it's in a state of constant improvement, continuous improvement, evolution, especially with technology, but regulatory oversight and reach has increased as well. The burden on a trustee has increased as well. Where would you say now, as you leave the industry, we are in terms of the right balance and thinking about the regulatory burden as well?
So looking at it from the member engagement perspective, I think the regulatory burden is just too much. It bemuses me. We all know, doesn't matter whether you're a civil servant or working at the regulator or a trustee or just a normal person going about their daily lives. We all know that if you give people more information, the more confused they get. And the less likely it is that someone will read something. I mean, if you go to a supermarket and you've got a choice of 4 washing liquids, then that's easy to make the choice. If you've got a choice of 30, it's impossible. That's just normal human experience. And yet the regulatory environment is such, particularly when it's about talking to members. More is better than less. And I think the TCFD report is a prime example. The authors want it to be accessible to members. And then when you look at the sheer length of it and the complexity of it, no member's going to be reading that, let alone understanding what they're reading. And I think the regulatory environment has lost its way when the regulator asks for more information to be provided for members. And that's not working. That's not helping us at all. There was a reason why in the 80s we started doing member annual reports, because members were not reading the formal report and financial statements from the trustees. So we did a summary of it. And then the regulators got involved with that by saying, if it's a summary, then you need to check that it's accurate and it's not misleading members. And it stems from a good motivation. You don't want members to be misled, but it ends up when actually I think they probably are, because they're just not reading anything. But when it comes to actually how we run our business, how we as trustees, I think we're probably about where we ought to be. But I do think that we are going to see an awful lot more regulation coming down the line. And I do question whether that is going to add value, particularly when you're in DB world, then fundamentally the employer will be picking up those costs. But actually now the more costs you heap onto DC through regulation, through demands on trustees, that directly impacts the member bottom line. And I am not convinced that what I think is going to happen is going to be value additive to members. And in DC, that really matters.
Right. Every basis point counts, of course. And just speaking of being a trustee, so you mentioned this additional regulatory burden, and how do you think that's going to affect the attractiveness of this role and the burden, I suppose, of continuous education and training?
I think it will make being a trustee much less attractive. One of the really great things that I found is getting the lay trustee, particularly from the membership, involved. And you look at what's required to be a trustee now and the professionalization of trusteeship. And I think that we are in danger of losing that member engagement because it is complicated. It's difficult. You look at the investment universe, particularly when you're looking from the DC perspective. And for members, lay trustees to get to grips with that on top of their day job, I think is becoming an increasingly challenging objective. But equally, there aren't enough professional trustees around to fully professionalize the trustee board. So I think there's a big challenge that we face with the regulatory burden, the requirement on training, on education, on keeping up to date. I think that we have got to keep that member involvement, which I found personally throughout my pensions career so positive. It's a really value additive to members because it comes back down to members at the heart. It just reminds you who you're being a trustee for.
And of course, it then pushes some burden back to advisors to translate this into plain English and conduct the training. But the more advisors we add to the mix, again, the more the cost burden. I'd like to ask a few questions now just about your leadership style and your ascent to that leadership, because that was remarkable over the course of time, getting to the deputy CEO role. Was that an intentional progression on your part, or how did that work until you got to the CEO position ultimately?
I would not describe myself as an ambitious person, although I think there are a lot of people that would disagree and say that I don't know myself very well from that perspective. All I ever tried to do was to find a job that interested me and stimulated me. So I'd got to the point prior to joining TPAS, I'd got to the point where I felt that there was nothing more for me to learn in the previous role. And I saw the TPAS job and applied for it and got it, which was fabulous. And it was a massive step change in many ways. Partly there was the responsibility of running the business, which coming from a larger organization to a much smaller one was a big change. And I loved that bit. I found that I enjoyed doing that. But TPAS looks at every sort of pension fund. So I'd gone in being, knowing contracted out final salary pension schemes inside out and upside down, to discovering that actually there's only one part of the pensions universe. Obviously, we know that now, but I went into that quite naively, I think. And I found that, learning was very stretching. It was very challenging, but I thoroughly enjoyed that. But after 5 years, frankly, I'd got fed up with members as complainants, because every member that contacted us was complaining about something. And I wanted to go back to a role where I could talk to members as members. And so I looked around and found the job at SAUL, applied for it and was appointed and never looked back. It's been a fantastic time. But to say that I didn't sort of get out of bed 30 years ago and map out a career, it's evolutionary again.
Lovely. And then your leadership style at SAUL. We spoke about the members first, but how would you describe your leadership style with your team?
I'm quite directive. And in fairness, when I arrived at SAUL, there was a hunger amongst the staff and the trustees for things to change, but there wasn't a clear vision of what that change should look like. And so when you're implementing that sort of change, a directive style was appropriate. The challenge that I found was that, and this is probably a function of time, but over time, that was what became to be expected of me. And so when SAUL STC needed something that was much more collaborative, I was not the right person to deliver that, because everybody was so used to me being directive or bossy, if you like, which is one of the things that pointed it out to me that it was time. Well, I thought myself, nobody actually said anything. In fact, quite a lot of people, when I said I was stepping down as CEO, said, why? And the answer was actually because the organization needs that. We need a fresh perspective. We need somebody coming in from outside with new ideas. And so it was absolutely the right time for me to go. And I think we can see how STC has developed subsequent to that, and the leadership of Sue, which has been brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I'm in awe of what she's achieved.
And that's interesting, because it's not many people would describe themselves as directive, but I think many people are. And I suppose it's particularly a challenge for women who describe themselves as directive, because, as you said, that can be translated into bossy. And one of my questions usually on the podcast is around diversity in the industry. And you did ascend in an industry probably at a time, and continues to be a time, that is not very well represented by women. Was that ever an issue for you, being a woman in a relatively male-dominated industry? Did it ever factor in any of your career choices?
No. I was brought up from day one to think that, I'm as good as anyone else. So I'm sure that there was probably some words said about me behind my back that was, I'm a pushy, bossy woman and I should get back in my box. But I can't think of any instance where I've felt that I've been impeded or my gender has been an issue, which is, as you say, in an investment industry which is driven by men largely, although it is changing. But certainly when I started, it was a male-dominated industry and remains that way to a large extent. I can't think of any instance where I felt that that was an issue for me. And maybe I'm just very thick-skinned and didn't notice it, which is entirely possible. But no, I think you just go and you do the job to the best of your ability, irrespective of your gender. And I expect to be respected for that. And I will respect others as long as they're doing the job to the best of their ability.
And one other question about career progression, just before we go on to some reflections. Any mentor or sponsor in that mix? You mentioned being driven by where the job is interesting and what stimulates you. And did you have any leadership representatives that you looked to for guidance or that had a role?
No, I didn't. I mean, the closest I got to a role model was Dennis Buckley, the chair of SAUL, but I didn't have any particular mentoring. Maybe I should have done a bit more of that, and I could have evolved my leadership style at STC, but I didn't. So I think it would have been really helpful, actually, to have had somebody to bounce ideas off. But I did have a very good network of people that I could talk to. So there's not one individual apart from Dennis that I would pick out, but you sit down and talk with the people I work with at the Raising Admin Standards, now PASA. When I was president of the PMI, there was a group of people there, people that I've remained in contact with subsequently, but not one specific individual.
And it's interesting because Dennis was, of course, chair of the board of trustees at this time. So I think, if I'm correct in that, so this would have been a nice example of, I suppose, how a CEO and a chair can interact in a very positive way.
Yeah, it was.
And then moving on to some reflections. So I'm sure you've been having many opportunities to speak to a group as you now finally retire and think about your career. What would you say were some of the high points and low points, looking back, whether it's SAUL or otherwise?
I think the high points, been all high points, to be honest, can't possibly all have been high points. The high points have been watching teams grow and develop. You know, when I first started, there was a desire for change, but people couldn't see how that change could be implemented, and actually helping people see what could be done and see people grow into roles. I remember one member of staff saying, "Oh, I'm very happy doing the job that I'm doing." And this has happened on lots of occasions, actually. And then you just test them, offer them something a bit extra, and they go, "Oh, that sounds interesting, I'll do that." And it sounds weird, but to watch people blossom as they develop and understand what they can achieve, I think is always the highlight of anybody in a management role. From a technical perspective, seeing SDC get Master Trust authorization, which was just such a grind. It was such hard work for the executive team. But for them to achieve that on our behalf as a trustee was also a massive, massive positive. We all celebrated that. It's the second time I've done it. I was on a Master Trust for a commercial Master Trust. And when we got authorization, when the regime was brought in, the funder was so thrilled. Us trustees all got vast bottles of expensive whiskey, which was a great treat. But again, it was the executive team that had done all the hard work. But to achieve that when it is such a complex thing to achieve is great.
Well, I suppose that maybe on the low point side, another way to ask the question is around any setbacks or challenges that you overcame. Because I think for someone with a career as long as yours, I'm sure the learnings from overcoming a setback would have a lot of wisdom in there for those of us still with many, many years to go. Anything that comes to mind as to any kind of hurdle you overcame?
The worst thing in my career, which has guided me, was actually when I joined TPAS as deputy CEO. And when I arrived, I didn't even have a desk, let alone an office. I had to move around. So I would sit in the CEO's office until he had a meeting, when I had to pick my papers up and move somewhere else. And I felt really quite unwanted. And then to discover, because we went out to lunch at the end of the first week, and he said, "Well, I didn't really want a deputy anyway, and the person that I chose wasn't you, but I got overruled by the other appointment committee." And that didn't fill me with a great deal of joy, I have to say. But you'd never go back, because you can't ever go back. So you have to go forward. And I just, okay, well, we are where we are. You've got me. I'll just work as hard as I can and learn as much as I can, because by then I'd already worked out that there was a huge amount for me to learn and prove my worth. And as it happened, he then unfortunately went off ill for a while. So I actually had to step into his shoes. And so when he came back, he could see that there had been some value in having a deputy. So it was positive. But in so many ways, that made me create a sense of treat others as you wish to be treated yourself. Everybody's employed for a reason. No companies, as I said earlier, companies make decisions on a commercial basis. So if they are going to employ someone in a role, that's because that role is needed. And it doesn't matter if that means that you're the most recent recruit or the CEO, you're all needed for that organization to function and function effectively. And the other aspect is, as I say, definitely treat people as you would wish to be treated yourself, and respect people for what they bring. It's just served me quite well.
And it's a very empowering message as well for everybody at every part of that organization, knowing the power that being hired gives you, because the very fact that you were hired, as you said, just gives you some aspect of being needed. Now you are, I think we've all heard from the LinkedIn message and speeches that this is it in terms of the final retirement. What does the next chapter hold for you? What are some of the things you're looking forward to doing?
So I'm looking forward to not having anything in my diary other than things I want in it. I'm looking forward to doing quite a lot of traveling. We've got trips to Madeira and to Singapore and Australia already lined up. We're thinking possibly Spain and Japan next year. And there's an awful lot of Europe that we've not been to. I mean, we'll be living in France. There's a lot of France we've never visited. There's huge swathes. I've been to Germany on business, but I've never visited Germany. It's a country that I know nothing of and would love to visit. So there's a lot of Europe that we want to visit and travel. So it'll be a mixture of travel and seeing friends and family and sitting on our terrace reading interesting novels.
Well, happy and excited as we are for this chapter for you, I suppose we are facing this, those are your colleagues, I say we, with some sense of loss, we are losing an absolute beacon of learning, of commitment, and of pensions knowledge. So as we lose you from the industry, are there any kind of parting words you can leave us in terms of maybe words of wisdom, a creed or motto that has stood you in good stead, that you have lived by, that you maybe, or advice for your younger self? A few different options there, because I'm sure that there is a lot of a well of wisdom to draw upon.
I think there are three things that I would say. One is never ask anybody to do something that you yourself wouldn't do. One is to know yourself and know your strengths. Someone pointed out to me a long time ago, they said that this is a really big ask. And I said, but I'm not asking anybody to do something that I wouldn't myself be able to do. I said, yeah, but you can do things so much more quickly than other people. And I hadn't recognized that. So I think recognize your differences in working style. Treat people as you would like to be treated yourself. Respect people. And in the pensions arena, put members at the heart of what you're trying to do, and that will bring it all together.
Well, I think it's so appropriate that we've ended where we started, because that is focusing on what really matters and never losing sight of that, I think has been really a hallmark of your career and an amazing stimulation for the rest of us to do the same. So thank you so much, Penny, for coming here. I know we're in the last week, so I feel very privileged to have snatched an hour of your time. Thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear from more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.